So earlier this week, The Boys released its penultimate episode. Here are my thoughts. I'm just going to say it up front. This episode was a disappointment, narratively and tonally inconsistent with both the rest of the season and with the rest of the series. The main reason for that is that it felt like there were two main plot lines that very lightly advanced the story, while everything else was just the side quest hour. The writing was so bad, the action so unimaginative, the plot so forgettable that, and I've said this previously, this show right now really feels like maybe a CW or ABC network dramedy, though one wherein the writers can include more blood, drugs, and swearing than would fly on network television. This show's creator promised us that The Boys Season 5 would be the apocalypse, and the marketing campaign literally included one shot of Homelanders hovering above Earth while it was bathed in nuclear fire, and one shot of a destroyed Vought Tower. And instead of any of the sort of action that type of imagery would telegraph, we've gotten Homelanders bathing in milk, crying, jokes about depraved acts of S, scene after scene of bad dialogue full of circuitous logic in dark buildings between the boys and their allies. The virus storyline that was so hyped up and promised in Season 4 and Gen V Season 1 was neutered into a storyline where only two D-list soups died from it and where Soldier Boy basically got a bad cold. Anyway, though, I'm rambling. I'll go ahead and get into my main highlights from this episode. The episode opens, I believe, a few weeks after the last episode, with the boys and sages regrouping in another safe house after escaping the woods after watching Homelander take the Compound B1 in the last episode. And that's honestly my first issue with this episode, how they actually managed to survive that long. How Homelander, with his increased powers from the Compound B1, never heard them or saw them when they were that close to him in the woods. Like, I remember back in Season 1 where there was a whole episode and a whole elaborate plan concocted by Frenchie and Butcher devoted to avoiding Homelanders detecting them while they were in a safe house in a major bustling city, because they knew that even in the city he could detect them with his senses. Yet this episode basically pretends that Homelander is incapable of detecting them in the empty woods, and after he's just had his powers drastically increased by Compound V1. Then the Homelander is God craziness, that's the next thing. And the way that Oh Father helps him peddle it in this episode with an eerie musical and an actual feature film wherein Jesus himself declares Homelander his successor officially became irretrievably creepy. And were it not for the fact that this is clearly intended as satire and I believe a playing up of the Judeo-Christian Bible's Antichrist narrative for storytelling purposes, it would cross the line into abidingly offensive. My distaste for Ashley just shot up a few thousand ticks more this episode when she read President Calhoun's mind and actually truthfully reported his literal second thoughts to Homelander, knowing that Homelander was going to unalive him like a fly, which Homelander immediately did. Just right from the start of this series, I have never much cared for Ashley. Her arc of being a yellow-bellied coward who enjoys depraved acts of S and who's always losing her hair has never connected with me, mostly because I tend to despise cowardly characters in shows like this. Season 4 kinda gave her some development with A-Train, but this season has just reversed it all. So at this point, I don't really care what happens to her. I really wish she'd just go ahead and get unalived. Nevertheless, sadly, I suspect it will not happen because characters of her kind somehow always manage to survive like cockroaches in shows like this. And like I mentioned in a previous video, I really could see an ending to this show where, like, maybe after all the madness and the war are over, Stan Edgar just returns to work at Vought, business as usual, with Ashley and her telepathic face by his side as an assistant or maybe even a vice president, helping give him a leg up on the competition. And that ending would actually be similar, very similar to what happens in the source material. The Gen V kids, or at least Jordan and Marie, finally appear in this episode, and it's just more disappointment. They basically get one cameo at the top of the episode wherein Annie, high on narcotics and having pathetically lost all hope, collects some intel from them about Oh Father before telling them to stop fighting and run for their lives, because there's no point anymore, and because Homelander is too powerful for any of them to stop. And they later on get another cameo at the end of the episode where they're hiding out at a safe house and where they agree to take in some refugees whom Homelander wanted unalived because they did not believe that he was God. And this brings me to two major grievances that I had with this episode and that I'll likely cover in later videos. And the first is that this is far too late to bring in the Gen V kids. Now, the writers do toss a fleeting attempt at explaining away their absence for this whole season by saying that they're always busy off on missions doing other stuff while the boys are doing their own thing, and explaining away how we never got a Marie Homelander fight, with a throwaway line by Marie in this episode about how the tales of her power are greatly exaggerated, and by Annie about how it's essentially too dangerous to risk losing Marie as a valuable asset when she cannot yet sufficiently control her powers to pose a true threat to Homelander. And I've honestly just got to call nonsense on that, because anyone who saw Marie's story as it unfolded throughout Gen V knows that at the end of that season, season 2, she was strong enough to fight soups of Homelander's basic power level, to bring people back to life, to control the compound V in people's blood in order to give them powers or possibly take powers from them. And yeah, it makes sense that maybe now the boys might have some caution about using Marie, seeing that Homelander has the V1 in his system and might be a bit more of a wild card. But keeping Marie out of the fight until now made no narrative sense in this season. Like, that's just such a stupid reason for keeping her back. And it's just so obvious that the writers painted themselves into a corner by making Marie so overpowered in Gen V, and just don't want to invest the energy to think of a smarter way to get around it now that the bill is coming due. Yeah! Anyway, my second grievance is with Starlight herself. I already didn't like her character and have not since season 4, but this episode just takes the worst parts of her to the next level. After watching Homelander get the V1 and seeing how much the nation of America hates her, she basically throws in the towel and has a dark night of the soul moment where she decides with no build-up that it's not worth the fight anymore and that everyone needs to just give up. She rags on the Gen V kids, whom she recruited, for wanting to continue the fight. Honestly, when the Gen V kids reacted with outrage towards her, and when Jordan said F her, I was just thinking the whole time, well, you said it, not me. And it takes the combination of a pep talk from MM, who finally does something this season after doing nothing for 6 episodes, and another pep talk from Marie, who actually quotes Starlight's own words from her 7 audition tape to her to get her back on track. Just the writing and the pacing on this are so terrible. There was no development of Annie this season up to this type of crash moment. And even if there had been, you don't do this type of arc in a show's penultimate episode. And you don't resolve it within that same episode. And another thing, the development where MM pep talks Annie back to herself just adds another layer of nonsense to this entire dynamic. Because MM has spent this whole season on an arc where he's been losing hope and developing a more careless approach to the world and even his own life and health, and now he just makes a heel turn to a positivity beacon because the episode needs him to do it. Anyway, moving on for now, I have to ask just where Butcher and the boys got enriched uranium to use in their plan to give Kimiko Soldier Boy's powers. I know that some viewers found it a cheap twist how Butcher and Frenchie were secretly working on the plan to replicate Soldier Boy's chest beam power in Kimiko this whole time, and undoubtedly it was. The way that the show just kind of throws that in at the top of the episode without even really allowing viewers to see how that discussion went with Kimiko and or Frenchie and Butcher is amateurish, but I actually find it more ridiculous how Butcher and Frenchie got access to enriched uranium so easily, and while they are still fugitives from all of America. Like, enriched uranium is not something you could just buy at a supermarket. This stuff is heavily watched and regulated by world governments. So did they get it from that room in the V1 unit from episode 4? If so, how? How did they get it out without poisoning themselves? How did they set it up in an abandoned elementary school without drawing attention? Just, this makes no sense. but onwards. The Deep storyline, as it has been in most of this show, was stupid. So he apparently did have one intelligent thought this episode and told Homelander that he only unalived Black Noir 2 because Noir, who's naturally too unalive to contradict the Deep story, was bad-mouthing Homelander. And I do see it as a minor storytelling issue that the Deep expected Homelander to not know that he was lying, but Homelander excuses it because he disbands the Seven and fires the Deep, ostensibly because he does not want to share the spotlight anymore. The Deep then gets the wind knocked further out of his sails when he learns that all marine life now blames him for that oil spill that Noir caused in the last episode, though it's never explained why, and has made a pact to unalive him if he ever sets foot in water again. And I have no idea how every sea creature on Earth would be able to enter into that pact, because sea creatures are not able to communicate on a universal level with each other, and definitely not in bodies of water that are separated from each other by hundreds or thousands of miles, as is all water on Earth. But that's what we get. So the Deep, who once again lives when I was really hoping he'd be unalive, is effectively condemned to the tragic and poetic fate of being an aquatic superhero who cannot enter the water, which starts to wreck his brand when civilians see him fearfully refuse to rescue a drowning man. This episode's use of Dognaught and She-Line, moving on, was yet another major disappointment. Homelander dispatches them with O-Father and several psychics to test anti-Starlighters in a focus group to determine if they're willing to accept Homelander as God. And when most of them are not, Homelander orders O-Father to unalive the so-called non-believers. O-Father, though displaying some reluctance, delegates that job to She-Line and Dognaught, which leads Annie and MM, who were spying on O-Father, to fight them to save the victims. And the whole time I was thinking of how this fight would have been so much more meaningful if it had been between the boys and, let's say, Black Noir 2 and the Deep, instead of two D-list soups who put in a handful of nothing appearances in Gen V and earlier episodes of The Boys Season 5. And if the fight had maybe included the Gen V kids alongside the boys. And if that had maybe been how Black Noir 2 and the Deep, to be honest, died, then that would have been a better way of handling this, and more spectacular, more epic. Yeah, I had no investment in this fight between the boys and these nowhere villain characters. I also have a feeling that She-Line and Dognaught were specifically included in this episode so that the writers could do an obligatory depraved S adjacent scene with them. This being a scene where She-Line chews or smells her own lady parts, and where she and Dognaught smell each other's butts to determine what the other had to eat. Yes, it's just as disgusting and gratuitous and cringy as it sounds. Next thing. So it turns out that leak about Soldier Boys wanting to go to Colombia for the women and the substances was actually completely true. I said in my reaction video regarding that leak that if it turned out to be accurate, it would be just ridiculous, and it is. First, because of the silliness and the hypocrisy of how Soldier Boy flip-flops on Homelander for what, the billionth time this season, when he wanted to unalive Butcher for backing out just once in Season 3 on their plan to unalive Homelander. Second, because of how he was just droning on in Episode 6 about how his one true love was Stormfront, after droning on in Season 3 about how his one true love was Crimson Countess, and now he just wants to bugger off to Colombia for the women who are there. It just makes no sense. And his telling Homelander that he only gave him the V1 because it's what Stormfront would have wanted opens up a gaping story plot hole, in that it makes me wonder why, if Stormfront would have wanted Homelander to have V1, she would not have tried to procure it for him in Season 3 or even earlier, seeing as she had to have known that some existed, given how close she was to Frederick Vought and the man's company. But at any rate, Homelander does indeed choke out Soldier Boy like in the leak, and put him back in his suspended animation tube to keep him close when Soldier Boy tells Homelander that he plans on leaving Homelander forever, that Homelander is still too weird, and that Homelander is not God. And that just brings up another plot hole, which is how can Soldier Boy go unconscious as fast as he does in this episode from lack of oxygen in maybe 3 seconds after being choked out? Up until now, he's been portrayed as far more resilient than that. Honestly, the only good thing that comes out of this scene is that epic supernatural reference joke by Soldier Boy about how he and Homelander would never engage in father-son activities like fixing up the old Impala. The Butcher Huey plotline this episode, which unfolds in a manner almost exactly like those leaks from this episode projected, with the exception that they're captured by a psychic, not another shapeshifter, who gets in their heads and tries to turn Huey on Butcher, was no less weak than I thought it would be. Like I said in my reaction to the leaks, it feels like the show is just trying to give Huey and Butcher something to do. The plotline also made me roll my eyes over how, yet again, Huey and Butcher seem to have plot armor in that the psychic gets what he needs from them, tells Homelander that he has them in captivity, and is told by Homelander off screen to unalive them. Like Homelander would not come personally to unalive someone he hates as much as Huey, or someone with whom he has as much history as Butcher, but no. He dispatches the D-list psychic to do it so that Huey can believably outsmart the psychic, so that Butcher can unalive the psychic, so that he and Huey can once again escape a certain doom. Also, annoyingly and nonsensically, Huey, like Annie, has magically lost all hope between last episode and now, with no build-up or context besides seeing Homelander get V1, despite being the one character who's been maintaining hope and advocating for it all this season. And it's just weird how Butcher, of all people, becomes the one this episode to pep talk him in vulgar Butcher format into continuing the fight until the bitter end. If anything, if the writers were going to do this type of Dark Night of the Soul storyline, which they still should not have done at this stage of things, what they should have done to maintain narrative consistency would be to maybe have Huey be the one to go on the mission with Annie and pep talk her back from the edge, and had MM be the one to go on a mission with Butcher and get captured with him and have to be talked back from the edge by him, one soldier to another. And that brings me to the final storyline of this episode, the Frenchie Kimiko Sage plotline, which, like the rest of this episode, was overwhelmingly underwhelming. If this show and this season had not already telegraphed it to death that Frenchie wasn't going to survive this season, this episode shows us a scene where he promises Kimiko that he and she will buy a house in France and get a dog and have kids once the war with Homelander is over. He says that specifically to get her hopes up while she's enduring the brutal radiation treatments that Frenchie and Butcher and Sage believe will help her gain Soldier Boy's V-stripping powers. Annoyingly and nonsensically, Sage is yet another character who goes through a Dark Night of the Soul arc this episode, where she crashes out and wastes her time with lobotomizing herself and peeing herself and eating junk food because her plan to destroy the world fell apart, and because she does not understand love and how it makes people do unpredictable things, which, while we're on that subject, has not been previously established for her character, and which is a pretty sloppy plot twist that gets tossed in at the 11th hour. Sage has been hyped up throughout this show as a perfect predictor of human behavior, whether those humans are in love or not. And now suddenly love is the one thing for which she cannot account. It's inconsistent with her previously displayed capabilities, not to mention one of the worst and most shallow tropes in stories about super genius villain characters. How the super genius fails because he or she cannot emote or account for or understand emotions. Anyway, Frenchie, of all people, actually pep talks Sage into coming back to herself and helping him perfect the plan to give Kimiko Soldier Boy's chest beam power, with a standard and even more tropey speech about how love is the last great beauty in the world because it's the only mystery that even the smartest person in the world cannot solve, about how Sage should not feel badly because she loved Thomas Godolkin or can't plan for what humans in love will do, and about how he's begging her to help him save the world and the woman he loves by helping him perfect the experiments on Kimiko. Sage does help him, obviously. Homelander figures out what they're doing and comes to unalive them all, even more obviously. and Frenchie hides Sage and Kimiko in a zinc-lined chamber before making noises to distract Homelander before he can find them, which in and of itself is still ridiculous, because wouldn't Homelander be able to hear their heartbeats or breathing regardless of if Frenchie is distracting him, and just come for them anyway after he finishes unaliving Frenchie? Also, how does Frenchie even know that Homelander, with the V1 in his system, has not gotten past his inability to see through zinc? Nevertheless, Frenchie's plan works. Homelander just abandons the search for Sage and Kimiko to come for him. Frenchie, realizing that he's not going to survive either way, exposes both himself and Homelander to the enriched uranium, and I'm not quite sure, because the scene cuts without depicting what happens next, whether Homelander finishes the job of mortally wounding him, or whether the uranium itself mortally wounds him. Either way, after Frenchie is mortally wounded, Homelander just gives up the search for Sage and Kimiko entirely. Never mind that he now knows that Kimiko is possibly the only real threat to him, and leaves. Kimiko and Frenchie have their naturally tragic goodbye, and Huey and Butcher show up just in time to watch Frenchie pass away. So I guess Homelander just didn't hear them either, or see them either, on his way out. Anyway, Frenchie's passing away just didn't really hit me that hard because of the weird way that it happened, and because of the general lack of blood or extremity. I really was expecting a character like Frenchie to go out bigger and more brutally and more epically than just crawling to Kimiko with barely any external scratches on him and slipping into the next life after a predictable moment where he somehow got just enough life left in him to say goodbye, as always happens with these types of scenes. But that's the end of the episode, and if you cannot tell already, I was really disenchanted with this one on so many levels. It's ironic that many of these leaks regarding this episode were accurate or accurate adjacent, but were more exciting and cooler in description as leaks than the way that they actually played out on screen as storylines. Like that leak about Homelander starting the episode by brutally and terrifyingly unaliving the president and taking over America, as opposed to the more subdued and matter-of-fact way that it actually happened on screen. Or like how the leaks reported an actual dialogue between the boys about the plan to give someone Soldier Boy's chest beam power before the decision to use Kimiko as the candidate, versus the slapdash way that the storyline is just thrown in like an afterthought when it was actually executed in this episode. Anyway, that's all for me for now. I've been talking long enough. Your turn. I want to know what you think. Sound off in the comments below. Definitely share your own opinions about this episode and how you think it'll all end in the finale. I've said many times before, and only feel more justified in reiterating now, that I do not think this show is going to be able to stick the landing, given how much it has left to accomplish in order to be truly satisfying. But if you do, definitely let me know. And when you're done, don't forget to like and follow for more.